Last time we spoke about the return to the Philippines. Admiral Halsey, in preparation for the Leyte invasion, devised a strategic ploy to lure the Japanese forces by feigning vulnerability. Despite significant air engagements and the heavy damage to two cruisers, Halsey's forces maintained control. Meanwhile, a massive convoy approached Leyte, and the Japanese launched a desperate counterattack. The battle severely depleted Japan's air strength, leading to the birth of the kamikaze corps. As Davison's carrier aircraft attacked, Japanese forces struggled due to bad weather and underestimated the Americans. General Tarachi activated Shogo 1, targeting Leyte despite disagreements with General Yamashita. Pre-landing operations saw U.S. Rangers secure islands, while heavy bombardments prepared Leyte for its invasion. MacArthur's forces landed amidst fierce resistance, capturing key positions. Though logistics were disorganized, U.S. troops gained ground, marking the beginning of a decisive battle in the Philippines, with the Japanese struggling to counter. This episode is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. For podcasts, I just released episode 7 in my ongoing series on the North African campaign during World War II. As for YouTube, I just released the first episode in a brand new series covering Japan's invasion of North China. This episode being Operation Nika, the Battle of Ruhe. This also happens to be the first episode with work done by the new animator that I'm paying using funds from my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. As we left off on the last episode, General MacArthur's forces successfully landed on Leyte, with General Sibert's 10th Corps landing in the Palo-Tacloban sector and General Hodge's 24th Corps at Dulag. In response, Admiral Toyota activated Operation Shogo, ordering Admiral Carreta's 1st Striking Force to move to Brunei Bay to destroy enemy warships and transports in Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, Admiral Oshima's 2nd Striking Force prepared to support counter-landings led by Vice Admiral Mikao Gunichi's Southwest Area Fleet. The planning for Admiral Oshima's small force was emblematic of the shambolic state of the Imperial Japanese Navy's organization for the battle. His force was originally assigned to Ozawa as part of the main body. Then it was detached to go down to Formosa to mop up Halsey's 3rd Fleet in the aftermath of the Battle off of Formosa. Then it was assigned to the Southwest Area Fleet based in Manila to spearhead an envisioned counter-landing on Leyte. The commander of the Southwest Area Fleet, Admiral Mikawa, determined that the Shima force was not required to accomplish the counter-landing mission. On October the 19th, Toyota rejected this and instructed Mikawa to use the Shima force as part of the counter-landing force. In spite of this, and after confirming that the counter-landing operation did not require Shima's force, Mikawa sent orders to Shima on the afternoon of the 19th that he was not required to stand by to support the counter-landing. Early in the afternoon on October the 21st, the combined fleet again ordered Shima to take part in the transport mission, and he ordered his force to Manila. At this point, 2 forces were assigned to the counter-landing operation with a total of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. This was a very questionable use of the combined fleet's limited resources. Kurita's 16th Cruiser Division was detached to reinforce the effort, and Admiral Ozawa's depleted main body was tasked with luring the enemy north, allowing Kurita to break through to the landing zone. Vice Admiral Ozawa's task force main body sortied from the Bongo Channel at the southern entrance to the Inland Sea on the afternoon of October the 20th, immediately after receiving the combined fleet's battle order. To heighten its effectiveness as a lure, the Ozawa force sortied with all of the 3rd Carrier Division, made up of the regular carrier Zukaku and light carriers Zoyo, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The total number of aircraft available to put aboard these ships, however, was only 108. These belonged to the poorly trained air groups of the 1st Carrier Division and represented about half the normal complement. In addition to the half-empty carriers, the force comprised 2 battleships, the Ise and Hyuga, 3 light cruisers, the Oyoda, Tama, and Zuzo, and 8 destroyers of the 31st Destroyer Squadron. At around 6 a.m. on the 21st of October, Japanese aircraft attempted to bomb the Allied ships in Leyte Bay. A Val dive bomber dove for Shropshire but broke away after heavy anti-aircraft fire was directed at it. The Val, damaged by Bofors fire, turned and flew at low level up to the port side of the nearby Australia before striking the cruiser's foremast with its wing root. Although the bulk of the aircraft fell overboard, the bridge and the fort superstructure were showered with debris and burning fuel. 7 officers, including Captain Deschanel, and 23 sailors were killed by the collision, while another 9 officers, including Commodore Collins, 52 sailors, and an AIF gunner were wounded. Observers aboard Australia and nearby Allied ships differed in their opinions about the collision. Some thought it was simply an accident, while the majority considered it to be a deliberate ramming effort aimed at the bridge. Following the attack, Commander Harley C. Wright assumed temporary control over the ship. Since Kurita lacked air cover, Tominaga's forces were regrouping in the Philippines to bolster Japanese air strength for Operation Shogo, while Admiral Fukudome's 2nd Air Fleet was assembling in the Manila area. At the same time, communication was lost with General Makino's 16th Division. Because of the typhoon of October the 17th, signal communications were simply impossible. Roads were washed out and impassable. Bridges were down. And for about a week from the time of the storm, when it first hit the island, elements of the 16th Division were scattered and out of contact with one another. While trying to assemble its forces for the operations, the Japanese were then hit by enemy bombardment, which further severely disrupted General Makino's radio-telegraphic communications. Additionally, the evacuation of Tacloban by the division's rear echelon, which began on early October the 20th, necessitated the abandonment of permanent wireless installations, and it resulted in a complete severance for 48 hours of all contact between the 16th Division and the higher headquarters at Cebu and Manila. During this critical period, the 14th Area Army and the 35th Army were completely without knowledge of developments on Leyte. General Suzuki initiated the Suzu Plan, preparing the 41st Regiment and 2 battalions of the 102nd Division to move towards Ormac. General Tarachi, having decided that the decisive battle would be fought at Leyte, directed General Yamashita to place the Provisional Tenpai Battalion, the 20th Anti-Tank Battalion, under Suzuki's command, and ordered Lieutenant General Yamagata Tsuyo's 26th Division to prepare for an early deployment to Leyte. Additionally, reinforcements from the 1st Division and the 68th Brigade soon arrived in the Philippines, and they were assigned to the 35th Army. The Japanese anticipated that the enemy would not move inland until the beachheads at Tacloban and Dulac were connected, so they aimed to gather reinforcements in the Karigata area before launching a major counteroffensive to crush the invading forces. In the meantime, Makino's 16th Division was tasked with holding off the enemy advance in eastern Leyte long enough to allow reinforcements to assemble. Reacting swiftly to the enemy landings, Makino sent the reserve 1st Battalion 20th Regiment and the 7th Independent Tank Company to strengthen the defenses at Palo and Dulag respectively. General Kruger, however, intended to move quickly through Leyte's Valley, aiming to secure key roads and airfields before the Japanese could regroup and mount a solid defense. The 1st Striking Force departed Linga at 1 a.m. on October the 18th and headed to Brunei Bay on the northern coast of Borneo. At Brunei, Kurita's ships refueled, and Kurita took the opportunity to confer with his officers. The details of Show 1 reached Kurita's force during the day on October the 18th. This made for a rather dramatic conference and reflected the unease many felt about the plan. Many officers at the conference were appalled that the fleet was being risked attacking enemy transports and doubted that they would ever get close enough to Leyte Gulf. Kurita probably had his own doubts about the plan, but after many of those presented expressed their doubts, Kurita reminded them of the glorious opportunity they had been given. "Would it not be a shame to have the fleet remain intact while the nation perishes?" was what Kurita said, and then he followed this with a plea. "What man can say that there is no chance for our fleet to turn the tide of war in a decisive battle?" And you know what? He wasn't wrong. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is actually the last large moment of the Pacific War where things could have technically turned around. Whatever their doubts, the crew and ships of the 1st Striking Force departed Brunei at 8 a.m. on October the 22nd and headed northeast through the Palawan Passage. Kurita's 3rd section, consisting of the old battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, stayed behind. These ships departed at about 3 p.m. and headed to the Balabac Strait and then into the Sulu Sea. If all went according to plan, they would storm Leyte Gulf through the Surigao Strait and meet Kurita's ships inside the Gulf on the morning of October the 25th. To the north, General Mudge's 1st Cavalry Division continued advancing northwest along the San Juanico Strait, with the 7th Cavalry liberating Tacloban with minimal resistance. The 5th and 12th Cavalry Regiments faced tougher opposition in the southwestern foothills, whence Colonel Roy Drake was killed by enemy machine gun fire, but they managed to secure Utap and Kaiban despite the swampy terrain. Over to the south, Colonel Aubrey Newman's 34th Regiment repelled a strong enemy counterattack, resulting in 600 Japanese casualties before launching an assault on Hill 332. Although only the northern knoll was captured by nightfall, the 1st Battalion 19th Regiment consolidated its position on Hill 522, while the 2nd and 3rd Battalions advanced towards Palo, with the 2nd successfully entering the town. Further south, Japanese artillery positioned on Catmon Hill targeted the beachhead area, while General Bradley's 96th Division advanced. Colonel May's 1st Battalion attacked the Japanese positions at Lepidan Head. The remaining forces of the 383rd Regiment moved west towards the point north of Tigbao, and Colonel Dill's 382nd Regiment made slow progress towards Tigbao. At the same time, General Arnold's 7th Division, after repelling 2 minor tank attacks, began advancing west towards the Buran airstrips, while the 32nd and 184th Regiments moved side by side. The 184th faced minimal opposition as it captured the Dulag airstrip and continued moving forward about 1,000 yards beyond the beachhead, whereas the 32nd had to overcome several bunkers and pillboxes to reach its objective. The next day, both regiments continued their westward advance, with the 184th stopping after 2,800 yards due to the increased enemy resistance, waiting for the 32nd to close the gap. To the north, May's 1st Battalion secured Labinan Hill and San Roque, while the rest of the 383rd Regiment advanced through Anibung to surround Catmon Hill, and the 382nd Regiment pushed through Tigbao and the Kanmangwe. In response to these developments, Makino decided to reorganize his southern forces to better defend Catmon Hill and Burian, while the 20th Regiment largely disengaged and retreated towards Hindang. Simultaneously, the 34th Regiment captured Hill 332, while Lieutenant Colonel George Tapman's 19th Regiment defended Palo from strong enemy counterattacks. The 3rd Battalion managed to reach the town, allowing the 2nd Battalion to launch an attack towards Hill B, though it was unable to capture its crest. Further north, while the 7th Cavalry secured the hills around Tacloban, Brigadier General William Chase's 1st Cavalry Brigade continued to face challenges advancing up the western foothills. In the morning, Kurita set sail from Brunei and headed northeast through the Palawan Passage, leaving Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji's Force C behind to advance through the Surigao Strait into Leyte Gulf. Taking the direct route along the western coast of Palawan, the 1st Striking Force was detected by submarines Darter and Dace in the early hours of October the 23rd. After reporting the enemy task force to Admiral Halsey and Kincaid, the submarines executed a coordinated attack at 6:10 a.m. The first torpedo struck Atago just as Kurita was having morning tea with his chief of staff. In total, 4 torpedoes hit the cruiser, dooming her instantly. I know he's never going to hear this because he doesn't listen to this podcast, but one of my best friends growing up, we play World of Warships together, and the Atago just happens to be his favorite ship. So, well, sucks for him. Sorry, totally random note there. 19 officers and 341 sailors went down with the ship. Kurita and his staff were thrown into the water and had to swim for their lives. The second salvo from Darter hit the cruiser Takeo, steaming behind the Otago. 2 torpedoes hit the cruiser, killing 32 crewmen and wounding another 30. Takeo was not only out of the battle, but her heavy damage put her out of the war. After eventually reaching Singapore, she was deemed unrepairable. On days, Claggett observed Darter's devastating attack. Claggett identified a Congo-class battleship for the attack and began its approach. 6 torpedoes were fired from a range of just 1,800 yards towards the target, which was actually the heavy cruiser Maya. The cruiser took 4 hits on her port side, and she sank in mere 8 minutes, taking with her 16 officers and over 320 men. Kurita narrowly escaped the sinking of the Otago, later transferring to the battleship Yamato after sending 2 destroyers to escort the damaged Takeo back to Brunei. The submarines then endured ineffective counterattacks from Japanese destroyers, although Darter ran aground on a reef while pursuing Takeo. This successful submarine attack not only diminished Kurita's force by 3 powerful cruisers, but it also provided the Americans with the location of the first striking force. In response, Admiral Oldendorf's fire support group established a battle line across the mouth of the Surigao Strait, and Halsey ordered his dispersed carrier groups to prepare for battle, recalling Task Group 38.4 immediately. Additionally, Vice Admiral Sakonju Namasa's 16th Cruiser Division, en route to Mindanao, with the 41st Regiment for Ormac, was tracked by submarine Bream near Manila Bay early on October the 23rd. This led to a torpedo attack that critically damaged the heavy cruiser Aoba, forcing her to return to Japan, where she would never be operational again. Despite these challenges, the first reinforcements successfully arrived in Ormac on the same day, after an uneventful voyage. At the same time, the Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy's air forces were rapidly assembling their resources in the Philippines in preparation for a coordinated air offensive set to begin on October the 24th, a day before the scheduled fleet attack. Over to the north, Ozawa's substantial but ineffective decoy force was positioned just due east of Okinawa, moving south into the Philippine Sea, while Shima's second striking force neared the Koran Islands. Back over in Leyte, Kruger's offensives were advancing pretty well. In the north, the 8th Cavalry had moved through the 7th and successfully captured a bridge over the Diet River. On October the 22nd, elements of the 5th Cavalry were sent to Tacloban to act as a guard of honor for General MacArthur. The Guard of Honor, consisting of First Lieutenant John Gregory and 30 enlisted men of the 5th Cavalry, arrived at Tacloban later on October the 23rd. Presidente Osmeña of the Philippine Commonwealth was also present, having come ashore for the occasion. A simple but impressive ceremony was held in front of the municipal building at Tacloban, though the interior of the edifice was in shambles. Broken furniture and scattered papers were everywhere. The Guard of Honor was described as dirty and tired but efficient-looking soldiers, and they were drawn up to the front of the governmental building. General MacArthur broadcasted an address announcing the establishment of the Philippine civil government, with Presidente Osmeña as its head. Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland then read the official proclamation. Presidente Osmeña spoke appreciatively of the American support and the determination of the Filipinos to expel the enemy. "To the color" was sounded on the bugle, and the national flags of the United States and the Philippines were simultaneously hoisted on the sides of the building. Colonel Ganglion of the guerrilla forces was then decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross. Few Filipinos except representatives of the local government were present for the ceremony. Apparently, the inhabitants had not even heard of it, or did not know that they were permitted to attend. Information quickly spread, however, that the civil government had assumed control, and as General MacArthur and his party left town, the civil population cheered them on. The 1st Cavalry Brigade continued its slow advance through challenging terrain before being reassigned to support the overstretched 24th Division in its rear. Newman's 1st Battalion made an unsuccessful attempt to capture Hill Nan, and the 19th Regiment similarly faced the daunting task of taking Hill B. On the night of October the 23rd, Colonel Suzuki Tatsunosuke, the commanding officer of the 33rd Regiment, led a raiding detachment armed with rifles, sabers, grenades, and mines in Palo from the southwest. Using Filipino civilians in front of them, the men of the detachment tricked the guards at the outpost into believing that they were other guerrillas. The Japanese were thus able to capture 2 machine guns and a 37mm gun. They penetrated to the town square and charged, throwing explosives into houses, trucks, and a tank, and they broke into an evacuation hospital where they killed some of the wounded there. They then moved towards the bridge and mounted the captured machine guns upon it, firing until their ammunition was exhausted, and then they abandoned the guns. The American guards on the other side of the bridge, however, were able to fire upon the bridge and its approaches so effectively that they killed 50 Japanese, according to the count made the next morning. The raid was completely broken up, and 60 Japanese, including Colonel Suzuki, were killed. The American casualties were 14 killed and about 20 wounded. Over to the south, the 383rd Regiment secured the Winarina River, while the 382nd conducted patrols. Even further south of that, Arnold deployed the 17th Regiment, reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of the 184th Regiment and the 767th Tank Battalion, to push through his advance elements and continue the assault westwards, with the other two regiments trailing 1,000 yards behind. This flying wedge maneuver proved highly effective, with the infantry securing San Pablo's airfield and the tanks advancing to the western edge of Buran. They disrupted the disorganized enemy forces and killed Colonel Okota Keijiro, the commander of the 20th Regiment. Meanwhile, at sea, Kurita's intact warships advanced into the Mindoro Strait by nightfall, while Nishimura's force was crossing the Sulu Sea. To the north, Ozawa's decoy force was deliberately broadcasting messages to draw enemy attention. Shima was also directed to penetrate the Surigao Strait to support Nishimura's assault, as Mikawa had determined that the 2nd Striking Force was not needed for the counter-landing mission. On Leyte, the troops continued their engagement on October the 24th, unaware of the impending major naval battle. In the northern region, to secure the San Juanito Strait and prevent Japanese reinforcements from Samar, the 1st Squadron, 7th Cavalry landed successfully at Babitgan. Troop C of the 8th Cavalry did the same at La Paz, and the rest of the 1st Squadron advanced to Quintatigan. By nightfall, these cavalry units had to repel a strong counterattack from the 2nd Battalion, 9th Regiment, which was stationed at Samar. To the south, Newman's 1st Battalion secured Hills Nan and Mike. His 2nd Battalion fought its way to a small hill southeast of Hill C. Chapman's 2nd Battalion continued its unsuccessful assault on Hill B, and his Company K captured San Joaquin south of Palo. Further south, the 382nd Regiment pushed through Hindang, causing the 20th Regiment units to retreat, and also secured Anibong, while the 383rd Regiment began patrolling its area. Meanwhile, the 17th Regiment, supported by the 184th, advanced along the road to Buran, following through the town, and began preparing for a push north to Dagame. Additionally, the 32nd Regiment attacked towards the Buri airstrip, but was eventually forced to withdraw. At dawn on October the 24th, the crucial air phase of Shogo began, with 200 aircraft of the 1st and 2nd Air Fleets taking off from Clark Field to patrol the waters east of Luzon. At 8:20 a.m., Admiral Sherman's carriers were finally spotted, prompting the launch of 3 waves of Japanese aircraft for an attack. The first attack in the morning was intercepted by 7 Hellcats from the Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, the air group commander. The quality of the Japanese air crews was very low. McCampbell methodically proceeded to shoot down 9 Japanese aircraft, for which he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and his wingman claimed 6 more. After the record action, he managed to return and land in the extremities on Langley, because the Essex deck was too busy to accommodate him, although he had run short of fuel. Altogether, aviators from the Essex were credited with 24 downed enemy aircraft, and the fighters from Lexington about 13. Despite the Hellcats' rough handling of the incoming Japanese strike, fleet air defenses was never airtight. At 9:38 a.m., one Judy dive bomber used clouds for cover and then made a skillful attack against the light carrier Princeton. The aircraft's 551-pound bomb hit the middle of her flight deck, some 75 feet forward of the aft elevator. It penetrated several decks to the ship's bakery where it exploded. The resulting blast reached its hangar deck where it engulfed 6 fully armed and fully fueled Avengers. These aircraft caught fire and soon exploded with a blast so powerful both ships' elevators were thrown up into the air. Water pressure was knocked out, which allowed the flames to spread rather quickly. All non-essential personnel were ordered off the ship at about 10:10 a.m., followed by all but the firefighting personnel 10 minutes later. In response, the cruiser Birmingham came to Princeton's aid but sustained severe damage from a major explosion and had to retreat to Ulithi, leading to Princeton being scuttled later that afternoon. The subsequent 2 waves of Japanese aircraft were successfully intercepted, resulting in the loss of 67 Japanese planes by the end of the day. Meanwhile, Tominaga launched a full-scale attack on the enemy invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf with minimal results. The failure to neutralize Halsey's carriers and Ozawa's undetected diversion mission allowed Admiral Mitchell to conduct a series of strikes against Kurita's force. That morning, American reconnaissance aircraft detected Kurita's 1st Striking Force just south of Mindoro, prompting Admiral Bogan to dispatch 45 aircraft under Commander William Ellis to attack the battleships Yamato and Musashi as they neared the Subian Sea. At approximately 10:30 a.m., aircraft from the Intrepid and Cabot began their attack. The lead group of the Japanese ships included the huge super battleship Yamato and Musashi. Of these 2, Musashi was the nearest, so Commander Ellis selected her as the main target. He split the 12 Helldivers into two 6-aircraft divisions to attack both battleships with their 1,000-pound bombs. The two nearest large ships were the subject of the Avengers' attack, and 2 were ordered to go after the heavy cruiser Myoko, and the other 6 were directed against Musashi. These were divided into 2 3-plane sections in order to execute an anvil attack. The 4 Avengers from Cabot were allocated against Yamato in the center of the formation. American pilots all remarked on the ferocity of the anti-aircraft fire from the multicolored 5-inch bursts to the streams of tracers from 25mm guns. The Japanese also used Type 3 incendiary shells from their 18.1-inch and 16-inch main battery guns. Despite the spectacular appearances of this barrage, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was generally ineffective. The giant Type 3 shells proved totally ineffective, and the Japanese records indicate that the battleships fired relatively low number of 6-inch and 5-inch shells during each attack, indicating that the fire control systems were taking too long to generate a targeting solution. These and the ubiquitous 25mm guns damaged many aircraft, but of over 250 aircraft that attacked during that day, only 18 were shot down. Though the numbers confirmed the ineffectiveness of the Imperial Japanese anti-aircraft fire, the American aviators displayed great courage, pressing home their attacks through what was described as an impenetrable wall of flak. Musashi was hit with 1 torpedo, leading to flooding and listing, and another torpedo struck the cruiser Myoko, which had to return to Singapore. For most of the day, Musashi was the center of attention. Due to a fault in the design of her side belt, slow flooding entered the adjacent boiler room. The effect of some 3,000 tons of water was a 5.5-degree list, which was quickly reduced to a single degree by pumps in the affected boiler room and counterflooding on the opposite. Facing Musashi's intact anti-aircraft batteries, 1 Avenger was shot down before it launched its torpedo, and a second went down after deploying its weapon. The 2 Avengers then attacked Myoko, and they were even more successful. At 10:30 a.m., 1 torpedo hit the heavy cruiser on her starboard side aft. Her propulsion system was damaged, and her top speed was reduced to 15 knots. The cruiser fell astern of the formation. Kurita was forced to send her back over to Singapore, as I had mentioned, for repairs without any destroyer escort. Since Myoko was the flagship of the Sentai 5, at 11 o'clock, the commander transferred to the cruiser Hagoro. Myoko limped back to Singapore and would be out of the war. 4 of Kurita's heavy cruisers were out of the battle before they even had a chance to engage the enemy. Cabot's small group of torpedo aircraft attacked Yamato, but the battleship dodged all the torpedoes directed at her. Concurrently, Nishimura's fleet was located by an enhanced search operation by Admiral Davison's carriers. At 9:18 a.m., 16 Hellcats and 12 Avengers from the Enterprise attacked the Yamashiro and Fuso battleships, hitting the latter with 2 bombs, though the damage was minimal. Operating to the west of Nishimura was Shima's 2nd Striking Force, and also in the area was Shima's Detached Destroyer Division 21, with 3 ships, which were hurrying to rejoin Shima's main force after having completed a transport mission to Manila. Franklin's Air Group was assigned to the northern sector of the Sula Sea. It spotted the 3 ships of Shima's Destroyer Division 21 just off Panay. Attacking high-speed destroyers was a challenge for any airman, but at 8:13, Wakaba was hit by a bomb and several near misses. The damage proved fatal. 45 minutes later, Wakaba sank with the loss of 30 men. Franklin launched a follow-up strike of 12 Hellcats and 11 bombers that reached the 2 remaining destroyers just after noon. Only 1 bomb hit was scored against Hatsushima, which did little damage. The Japanese commander decided to head back to Manila with the survivors of Wakaba. Inexplicably, he failed to notify Shima of his decision. Destroyer Division 21 was out of the battle. After this initial strike, Boyan sent a second wave of 42 aircraft which targeted Musashi between 12:07 and 12:15. Again, Helldivers opened the attack. The 12 bombers scored at least 2 direct hits and 5 near misses. 1 1,000-pound bomb hit forward and passed through Musashi's bow without exploding. The second hit just to her port side of the stack and penetrated 2 decks before exploding. The resulting damage forced the abandonment of the port side inboard engine room, which reduced the ship to 3 shafts. A fire near one of the boiler rooms was quickly extinguished. Adding to the chaos, Musashi's steam siren was damaged, and it continued to sound off and on for the remainder of the action. Once again, Intrepid's Avengers deployed to conduct an anvil attack. Of the 9 aircraft, 8 got their torpedoes into the water and headed towards the huge battleship. As was the case of the entire series of attacks, it is impossible to precisely trace the number of hits suffered by Musashi. American and Japanese records do not even coincide on the overall number of attacks during the day. It is probable that the second wave of Avengers put about 3 torpedoes into Musashi's port side. One hit near the stack of the junction of the outboard port engine room and the port hydraulic machinery space. It caused slow flooding, but little else. Another hit forward of the armored citadel and caused massive flooding into several large spaces. The last confirmed hit occurred aft the turret number 2. Despite these 3 additional hits, Musashi remained on an even keel, but was noticeably down by the bow. In the exchange, Musashi's anti-aircraft gunners forced one Avenger to ditch some 50 miles away and shot down 2 Helldivers. During this attack, Japanese records indicate 9 Type 3 shells were fired. American pilots were impressed that they were engaged at 25,000 to 30,000 yards, but no aircraft were damaged. This action reduced Musashi's speed to 22 knots, prompting Kurita to slow his formation. Despite taking 4 torpedoes, Musashi's skilled damage control teams managed to keep her afloat throughout the day. At 10:50, Sherman launched 58 aircraft from the Essex and Lexington, focusing on Musashi again by 1:30 p.m. With her speed reduced and unable to fully maneuver, she was a much easier target. Despite the heavy fire directed against them, the Helldivers performed their mission on preparing the way for the torpedo bombers. At least 4 1,000-pound bombs hit Musashi. 3 hits caused minimal damage as they impacted near the forward 18-inch turret and exploded in unoccupied crew and accommodation spaces below. Damage from the final hit that exploded on contact when it hit the starboard side of the stack was quite serious, but the explosion devastated many nearby 25mm triple mounts and caused heavy casualties amongst the gun crews. While the Helldivers added to the topside carnage, damage from the Avengers was to be much more serious. 3 more torpedo hits were confirmed in the third attack, bringing the total to 7. 2 struck forward of the armored citadel on either side of the bow. The design flaw of having comparatively little compartmentation in the unarmored forward section of the ship led to massive flooding. In addition, the explosions forced the hull plating outwards, creating what looked like a huge plow through water up as the ship moved forward. This definitely increased the flooding and forced the abandonment of the starboard hydraulic machinery room. A possible 4th hit was reported by some witnesses near the forward 6.1-inch triple turret on the starboard side. This assault resulted in at least 4 bomb hits and 3 torpedo hits, causing severe flooding overall. Despite this, Musashi continued to fight, but with its speed now reduced to 12 knots, Kurita ordered it to be moved over to the west with destroyers Shimakaze and Kinoshima. Additionally, the cruiser Tone was struck by 2 bombs during this attack and sustained just little damage. At 2:26, 12 Helldivers and 8 Hellcats from the Essex launched an assault on the Yamato and the Nagato, delivering 3 bomb hits against Yamato and 2 against Nagato, though the damage was not too severe. The 5th air attack of the day was the most intense, with 65 aircraft from Enterprise and Franklin taking off at about 1:15 to strike the heavily damaged Musashi by 3:10. The results against the near-defenseless battleship were absolutely devastating. Of the 18 Helldivers that dove on Musashi, 11 claimed hits. On this occasion, the aviators' claims were not inflated. Japanese sources agreed that within minutes, Musashi was pounded by at least 10 1,000-pound bombs. This barrage can be detailed with some degree of certainty. 1 bomb hit forward of turret number 1 and added to the damage there from earlier bombs. Another bomb hit the roof of the same turret and failed to penetrate its thick roof armor. Another hit the starboard side of the turret and penetrated 2 decks before exploding against the main armored deck. The 2 bombs hit together between the forward 6.1-inch turret and the superstructure, exploding on contact, and did minimal damage. Another 2 hits, just to the port in the same general area, penetrated 2 decks and exploded on the main armored deck without penetrating. The 8th bomb hit the port side of the massive superstructure and exploded on contact, causing devastation to the nearby 25mm mounts and their crews. Another projectile hit the top of the superstructure and destroyed the main battery fire control director and its rangefinder. The resulting explosion caused significant personal casualties on the bridge, an operations room totaling 78 killed and wounded. Among the wounded was the ship's captain. The final hit landed abaft the superstructure, but caused only minor damage. Musashi was equally helpless against the Avengers. The 8 Enterprise Avengers conducted a naval attack, and all claimed hits. At this point in the action, the accounts of Musashi's surviving crew members are not even reliable. It is certain that 4 torpedoes hit the ship. The first was on the port side in the area of her magazine, turret number 1. Another hit on the port side was recorded abeam of the superstructure, flooding a boiler room. The third hit to the port was placed just after the stack. It was in the same area as the earlier hit, and it immediately flooded the outboard engine room. The only confirmed hit on the starboard side occurred in the area of turret number 2. On top of the 4 confirmed hits, some Japanese accounts mention as many as 6 more. 2 of these struck amidships on the port side but did not explode. All attacking aircraft returned safely, confirming the ineffectiveness of Musashi's defenses by this point. At 3:21, Helldivers targeted the Karuna, but only managed to get about 5 near misses upon her. The increasing intensity of the air attacks throughout the day indicated that the Japanese land-based air forces had completely failed to neutralize Halsey's carriers. Consequently, at 3:30, Kurita ordered his fleet to change course westwards, away from the San Bernardino Strait, hoping that this maneuver would reduce the pressure from air attacks and allow the Japanese air forces to achieve better results. Meanwhile, Bugan launched his third strike of the day at 3:50, with 31 aircraft under Ellis targeting the Musashi for one final time. However, due to fatigue, the attack was quite ineffective. After this last strike, Kurita decided to head back towards the San Bernardino Strait and instructed the then-sinking Musashi to beach itself on Sibuyan Island. But before this could be executed, the battleship sank at 7:36, resulting in the loss of over 1,023 lives. Thus, the super battleship Musashi became the largest ship ever sunk by air attack, in what was the largest air-sea battle in history up to that point. Despite losing 18 aircraft, the Americans succeeded in sinking the Musashi, torpedoing the Myoko, and damaging 3 other battleships in varying extents. Nevertheless, the first striking force emerged in better condition than anticipated, with the Musashi absorbing much of the torpedo and bomb damage and allowing the other ships to weather the attack. Kurita planned to navigate San Bernardino Strait during the night, proceeding down the east coast of Samar and reaching Leyte Gulf at around 11 a.m. Meanwhile, Admiral Mitscher's search planes had located Ozawa's carriers at 4:40 p.m. By the afternoon, Ozawa had launched most of his aircraft in an attack on Sherman, but the final assault by the once formidable IJN carrier force achieved only limited success, with the 28 planes lost before retreating to the Philippines. Remaining undetected, Ozawa then dispatched 2 battleship carriers and 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Matsuda Chiaki, southwards, drawing the Americans' attention to his position. In the afternoon of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Americans did not know the IJN had no prospects for replacing its lost aviators, because the majority of the carriers themselves survived the battle, and the Americans knew other carriers were being added to the force. The IJN's carrier force was still quite a threat. The intelligence Halsey received on the IJN's carrier force indicated that it was fully capable. In every other major battle of the war, the IJN carrier fleet was the main threat. The Pacific War had become a carrier war, and surface forces had been firmly supplanted as a primary striking force. The Americans had no way of knowing that the Japanese had turned this thinking on its head in their planning for Leyte Gulf, however. Admiral Nimitz wanted to destroy the combined fleet, and thus gain an increased measure of operational freedom for the future operations. He was disappointed that this did not occur at the Philippine Sea, and thus he had inserted this instruction to Halsey, that the destruction of the Japanese fleet would be his primary objective if the opportunity was presented. Achieving this not only would eliminate the main threat to the invasion, but it would cripple the IJN's ability to interfere with future operations. As the assessment from the aviators was that Kurita's force no longer posed a threat, at 7:50 Halsey ordered his entire force north to crush what he assessed to be the primary threat, Ozawa's carrier force. He decided to do so with the entirety of his force. By doing so, he decided to ignore the threat posed by the Kurita force, which was heading towards the San Bernardino Strait. He kept his whole force together because that was how Task Force 38 fought, and because, as he stated after the war, he did not want to divide his force in the face of the enemy. A decisive victory was most likely if the carriers of Task Force 38 worked with the battleships of Task Force 34. This was the United States Navy doctrine, and Halsey fully supported it. At 8:22 p.m., Task Force 38 set course north, with the 3 carrier groups in the area meeting just before midnight. Earlier, at about 8:05 p.m., a night reconnaissance aircraft from Independence had reported Kurita's formidable surface force was heading back towards the San Bernardino Strait. This news raised concerns amongst several of Halsey's subordinates, including Bogan and Lee, but they were dismissed by the resolute Halsey. As a result, the 3rd Fleet's full strength continued northwards towards Ozawa's decoy force, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unprotected. This left Kurita's battleships unopposed between themselves and the American landing vessels, except for Kinkaid's vulnerable escort carriers off Samar's coast. Meanwhile, the detection of Nishimura's force on October the 24th gave Kinkaid enough time to prepare for a battle at the Surigao Strait. Oldendorf set up his battle line under Rear Admiral George Whaler near Higantugan Point in the northern part of the strait, providing maximum sea space while still constraining Japanese movement. 8 cruisers in 2 groups were positioned south of this line, with over 24 destroyers stationed to screen the battleships and cruisers, and positioned themselves on both flanks to launch torpedo attacks against the approaching Japanese. Additionally, 39 PT boats were deployed in the southern approaches to the strait and into the Mindanao Sea to provide early warning and possibly execute torpedo attacks when possible. The main issue was that the battleships were primarily equipped with high explosive shells, and they would only engage once the Japanese forces were about 20,000 yards away. Moreover, Kinkaid had intercepted an order from Halsey to assemble a powerful task force of fast battleships. Misinterpreting the order's unclear wording, Kinkaid mistakenly believed Task Force 34 was coming to defend the San Bernardino Strait, allowing his forces to concentrate on the Surigao Strait instead. Despite Kurita's delays, Nishimura pressed on to breach the strait, advancing with the heavy cruiser Mogami and 3 destroyers. Little is known about Nishimura's precise thinking as he approached the strait. He was planning on arriving at Tacloban at about 4:30 a.m. on October the 25th, in accordance with Toyota's master plan that had Kurita's force arriving off Leyte a short time later. This schedule fell apart after Kurita's advance was thrown off schedule on the afternoon of October the 24th, when he temporarily turned around in the face of an intense air attack in the Subian Sea. At 8:13 p.m., Nishimura sent a message to Toyota and Kurita that he planned to arrive off Tulag at 4 a.m. the next morning, a half an hour later than planned. This was only a minor change, but much more important was the receipt at 10 o'clock of Kurita's message that he would not be off the Gulf until 11. This meant that Nishimura's force was on its own when it executed its attack into the Gulf. However, Nishimura did not change his plan after learning Kurita's revised intentions. He was determined to force the strait in darkness, and in doing so draw forces away from Kurita's main attack. The battle began at about 10:36 p.m. when PT-131 gained radar contact on Nishimura's main force. The 3 boats of the section headed towards the contact to make a torpedo attack. 2 of the boats were slightly damaged, but one was able to close within torpedo range. News of the contact did not reach Oldendorf until about 12:26 a.m. on October the 25th. Another section sighted the advance group built around Mogami at 11:50 p.m., and 2 of the boats fired a torpedo at the cruiser. Neither hit its target. Demonstrating the confusion in any night battle, at about 1 a.m., Mogami was hit by a 6-inch shell from Fuso. Though it was a dud, it killed 3 men. About an hour later, PT-134 closed within 3,000 yards of the Fuso and fired 3 torpedoes. Again, all missed. This running series of encounters continued up until about 2:13 a.m. Of the 39 boats, 30 contacted the Japanese and launched 34 torpedoes. None of Nishimura's ships were hit. While Nishimura's force was successfully fighting its way up the strait in good order, he kept Kurita and Shima informed of his progress. At about 12:40 a.m., 2 parts of Nishimura's force reunited. First blood went to the Japanese, since 10 PTs were hit and 1, the PT-493, was sunk, with a total of 3 dead and 20 wounded. Though unable to exact any attrition upon the Japanese, the PTs had provided an invaluable service informing Oldendorf of Nishimura's location and strength. Based on an earlier report from one of Mogami's scout aircraft on the location and numbers of the United States ships in Leyte Gulf, Nishimura appeared to believe that the battle would occur inside Leyte Gulf and not in the Surigao Strait. If he really believed that Oldendorf would not use favorable geography to his advantage, he was sorely mistaken. Having survived the PT boat Carnage with no damage, Nishimura now faced a much more deadly threat. This came in the form of 5 Fletcher-class destroyers under the command of the aggressive captain, Coward. Ironic name, I know. Perhaps it's because of his name that he was so aggressive. 2 other destroyers from Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54 were left on a picket duty and did not take part in the torpedo attack. The 5 destroyers assigned to the attack were arrayed to conduct an anvil attack, with torpedoes coming from both bows of the enemy target, with McDermott and Monson from the west, Remy, McGowan, and Melvin from the east. Approaching at about 30 knots, Coward's ships would launch torpedoes guided by radar and refrain from using their 5-inch guns so as to not give away their positions. Once the torpedoes were on their way, the destroyers would break off and head north along the coast to clear the area and reduce the possibility of friendly fire incidents. What ensued was one of the most successful attacks of the entire Pacific War. Shortly after 3 a.m., Coward's 3 eastern destroyers launched 27 torpedoes from a range of about 9,000 yards at the advancing Japanese ships. They scored 2 critical hits on the Fuso at 3:08 a.m., causing flooding and fires. The battleship, unaware of the severity of the damage, veered off course and headed south, ultimately sinking at 3:45 a.m. with 1,620 lives lost. The Americans claimed that the torpedoes had split the Fuso in 2. Meanwhile, Coward's 2 western destroyers fired a full salvo of 20 torpedoes at 3:10 a.m. In response, Nishimura changed course, exposing his screen to danger. By 3:19 a.m., 3 torpedoes from McDermott struck the Yamagumo, which exploded and sank within just 2 minutes. Another torpedo hit the Mishishio amidship, causing it to sink about 15 minutes later after coming to a halt. And a final torpedo hit the Asagumo, damaging its bow and reducing its speed, forcing it to withdraw from the battle. McDermott's 10 torpedoes were the most effective salvo of the Pacific War from any American destroyer. Monson's torpedo attack resulted in a single hit on the battleship Yamashiro, causing some flooding and reducing her firepower by a third. Following Coward's devastating torpedo strike, 6 more destroyers, divided into 2 groups of 3, approached Nishimura's force from the west along the coast of Leyte. The first group commenced their attack at about 3:23 a.m., launching 14 torpedoes from a range of about 6,000 to 6,800 yards. But only 1 torpedo struck the Yamashiro, temporarily slowing her to 5 knots. The second group of destroyers fired 15 torpedoes at 3:29 a.m., but none of the torpedoes hit their targets, and the gunfire from both sides proved quite ineffective. After this failed assault, 9 destroyers in 3 sections of 3 approaching Nishimura's weakened column from both flanks. The first 2 sections attacked from either side, firing a half salvo of 5 torpedoes from each destroyer, but none hit. Before the final section could launch its attack, a fierce gunnery battle was underway. The gunnery battle began at about 3:51 a.m. when the first American cruiser opened up. 2 minutes later, West Virginia commenced fire at about 22,000 yards. All ships fired at the largest radar return of the 3 Japanese ships, which happened to be the Yamashiro. The American barrage grew as each battleship gained a fire control solution. The 3 ships with the most modern fire control systems did most of the work. The USS California joined in at 3:55 a.m. from about 20,000 yards, followed by the Tennessee a minute later. The 3 battleships with the less capable Mk3 fire control radar struggled to gain a firing solution. Maryland opened fire at about 4 a.m. by ranging her Mk3 radar on shell splashes from the other battleships. Mississippi took until 4:12 a.m. when she started to fire a full salvo at the Yamashiro at about 19,000 yards. Pennsylvania never gained a good solution for her 14-inch main battery and failed to fire a single salvo. Unbeknownst to Nishimura, the Americans had executed a T maneuver, leaving his ships able to fire only their forward guns while the enemy could unleash their full broadsides. Concentrating their fire on the Yamashiro, Ollendorf's cruisers and battleships landed several hits during the 18-minute engagement. By 3:56 a.m., the Yamashiro was seen burning amidship, aft and in the bridge area. Despite this, the battleship fought back fiercely, targeting the cruisers Phoenix, Columbia, Shropshire, and Denver, though no hits were achieved. The Mogami endured severe damage during this engagement, with the cruiser Portland focusing its fire on her and inflicting heavy harm. In the early phase of the battle, she took several 5-inch hits from the American destroyers. In the first minutes of the withering barrage from Ollendorf's cruisers and battleships, Mogami sustained more damage, including a hit in one of her 8-inch turrets. After firing 4 Type 93 torpedoes at 4:01 a.m. against the gun flashes from the enemy ships in the north, she came under fire from the heavy cruiser Portland. 2 8-inch shells hit Mogami's bridge at 4:02 a.m., killing her commanding officer, and other shells disabled 2 engine rooms. The new commanding officer decided to break off the action and head south at a very slow speed. While heading south, she encountered the 2nd Diversionary Attack Force. As American gunfire pummeled Yamashiro's superstructure, the last destroyer group approached head-on, closing to within 6,000 yards before launching 13 torpedoes. Before the torpedoes could reach their targets, the destroyers came under friendly fire and further assault from Yamashiro's guns, resulting in the Albert W. Grant taking 18 hits before being withdrawn. Observing the friendly fire, Old North ordered a ceasefire at about 4:09 a.m., allowing Nishimura to begin a retreat south. However, by 4:11 a.m., the Yamashiro had been hit by 3 torpedoes from the final destroyer salvo, causing a severe list and bringing the battleship to a halt. Yamashiro's valiant yet ultimately futile resistance ended at 4:19 a.m. when she finally capsized to port, taking Nishimura and 1,625 men down with her. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. As for podcasts, I just released a rather incoherent and, to be honest, I was a bit drunk with some friends episode on a very not-so-serious subject about how Japan could never win World War II, under any circumstance. If you want a few laughs, I do recommend it. And over on YouTube, I just released the first episode with my brand new animator, who I paid using funds from my Patreon account, found over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for just $2 a month you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Well, that episode on YouTube is going to be the first part in a larger series about Japan's invasion of northern China. The first episode is titled Operation Nika, the Battle for Ruhe. And also, for those of you who aren't comfortable with joining a Patreon, I now am opening up a YouTube membership, so that can be found, of course, over at my YouTube channel, and it'll be identical to the Patreon, same price, same perks, and everything. All of the funds from the membership and Patreon go to my new animator because I want to do larger and more interesting projects in the future. The largest naval battle in human history had only just begun. As many historians argue, given the fateful decision of Admiral Halsey to try and knock out the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, the transports had been left completely open to an attack. Absolute carnage could unfold on an unprecedented scale, perhaps enough to cause America to rethink continuing the war.